Welcome, everybody. My name is Daniel Rothenberg, and I'm co-director of the Future Security Initiative. And you're joining us this evening for a really excellent presentation as part of our spring speaker series. So we're honored to be joined by Karima Bennoune, who is a professor, the Lewis M. Sims Professor of Law at the University of Michigan. Her presentation is called "The International Obligation to Counter Gender Apartheid in Afghanistan." Karima is a professor and scholar that specializes in public international law and international human rights law with a focus on culture, extremism, terrorism, and women's rights. She served as the UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights from 2015 to 2021. She's appointed as an expert at the International Criminal Court and has addressed the UN Security Council about gender apartheid in Afghanistan. Previously, she was on faculty at the University of California Davis School of Law and on the Rutgers School of Law-Newark. Her book, Your Fatwa Does Not Apply Here, received the 2014 Dayton Literary Peace Prize for nonfiction, and her TED Talk based on the book, When People of Muslim Heritage Challenge Fundamentalism, has received more than 1.5 million views. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. Karima, thank you. The floor is yours. After Karima speaks, we'll have a little time for Q&A, and welcome.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And good afternoon, good evening, Ramadan Kareem to anyone who is marking the holy month. And many thanks to the organizers at the Future Securities Initiative for giving me this opportunity to speak with you. The initiative's goal of reimagining a more holistic concept and vocabulary of security in light of contemporary challenges with the goal of finding transformative solutions is one that I very much appreciate and identify with. And I think this can be an important rubric under which to consider my topic for today. And so I'm just going to put up a PowerPoint to use while I continue speaking. And I am assuming you can see that. Please let me know if you can't. So I'm going to talk about the idea of using the emerging legal concept of gender apartheid to try to more effectively address the worsening women's human rights catastrophe in Afghanistan. And in doing this, I'm going to draw from a paper that I published in the Columbia Human Rights Law Review in December of 2022 entitled, as you see on screen, The International Obligation to Counter Gender Apartheid. And I'm going to start by providing some explanation of why and how I wrote this paper. And then I'm going to discuss some recent developments in the field. And then I really look forward to your questions and your discussion. So just a little note about why I wanted to write this paper. I am an Algerian American human rights lawyer, and my interest in Afghanistan was actually first sparked by the events in my father's home country back in the 1990s, with the rise of extremism and fundamentalist armed groups that were sort of the equivalent of Daesh or the so-called Islamic State of the 1990s that were battling the Algerian government in a conflict that would lead to somewhere between 100 and 200,000 deaths. We don't actually know the specific figures. And in those times, the worst of the Algerian jihadists were people that we referred to as Afghans because they had had training in Afghanistan. They had gone to fight in the conflict there and come home with that training. And of course, when I went to Afghanistan for the first time, people told me, "Oh no, we call them the Arabs," which I understood. But in any case, we felt this very strong connection because of this shared experience of living on the front lines of extremism at that time, and also having an international community that doesn't really adequately understand the degree of the threat to your society. And so it's really out of that I started working on Afghanistan, and I traveled to the country 3 times going back all the way to the 1990s. And I encountered every time the most dedicated women's movement whose work has been highlighted when it was useful and then sort of conveniently overlooked. And so my goal with this project was to try to find a way to enhance international responses to the situation to find ways to ensure that the international community can't simply walk away from its obligations to Afghans just by leaving the country. And there isn't a lot in international law about sort of standards on second state responsibility. So I turn to this construct of gender apartheid that I'm going to explain as a means of achieving this goal. And I should mention, and this ties into the slide that you see on screen, that this is not a new idea. What's new is the sort of international legal architecture that I tried to give to this concept. But in fact, the notion of gender apartheid goes all the way back to the 1990s. And I was even told by one Iranian woman human rights defender, even in the late 1980s, women in some Muslim majority contexts were talking about this concept to refer to the project of various fundamentalist groups and governments that were seeking to exclude women in really systematic ways. And I think it's no accident that the first UN expert to refer to Taliban rule as being a kind of apartheid was from a Muslim majority country. And that's the man you see on screen, Abdel Fattah Amour, who was a Tunisian law professor. And at the time, he was the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief. And in 1999, during the first version of Taliban rule, he said very specifically that women in the country were being subjected to apartheid. And he pointed to some of the same exclusions and restrictions that we're seeing today in terms of the ban on women working, the ban on women and girls going to school. And he saw this as really anathema to human rights. And so I'm really kind of picking up on this tradition and trying to build the legal framework to support this particular view of the situation for a range of reasons that I will talk about in a minute. I should also say I'm building here on the work of feminist international law scholars who from around the world since the 1990s have been trying to deal with problems associated with the lack of inclusion of women's experiences of human rights violations in international norms and in the way we interpret them. And so that is a piece of the backdrop to my work here as well. So, to try to achieve some of these objectives, the article that I wrote draws from the academic literature and from international norms and jurisprudence on women's equality and racial apartheid, but also on a series of 17 interviews that I conducted remotely with Afghan women human rights defenders from every region of the country, from many different ethnic groups. Between September of 2021 and February of 2022. And of course, Professor Rothenberg is an anthropologist, so I probably don't have to convince him of this point. But I believe that field work, although it's rarely done in the academic discipline of international human rights law, can make a critical contribution to scholarship by bringing together theory and practice. And in relation to Afghan women in particular, this methodology is a way of moving away from the much criticized savior narratives by making sure that Afghan women human rights defenders are not just the objects of the work, but also participants in it whose views help to inform it. So here's what I'm going to focus on, drawing from a very long law review article. Basically, what do we mean by gender apartheid? What is the added value of using this approach to tackle the situation in Afghanistan? What can we learn from the South African experience that is helpful here? What are the policy and security implications of using this construct? And finally, what interpretive and other strategies do we need in terms of the way forward for actually implementing this approach so that it can hopefully make a difference in the lived experience of Afghan women, which is the whole point. And I'll get through as many of these points as I can, but I definitely want to save time for a good discussion with all of you afterwards. So let me turn to what is really the easiest question here, and that is, what is gender apartheid? And I describe it in my article as a system of governance based on laws and or policies which imposes systematic segregation of women and men, and may also systematically exclude women from public spaces and spheres as it does in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, And it involves systemic oppression of women, really totalizing oppression across all spheres of society, treating women as being, as one of the Afghans I interviewed, not as human as men. This is what she said. This is how she described the experience. And in this way, it mirrors the experience of Black South Africans under the apartheid regime. And so, what I'm really doing here is adapting from the international law on racial apartheid and doing that to emphasize that this is a very particular human rights problem. This is a situation in which systematic discrimination has been made the mode of governance itself. And that situation, just like racial apartheid, requires particular strategies if we're going to be able to make any progress in improving the human rights situation. So this is my description of gender apartheid. And we can also fit this nicely into the definition of apartheid that we have in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. If we add gender alongside race, and in fact, the UN Special Rapporteur on Afghanistan and the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women, in a joint report last summer, suggested that we should consider doing just that. So we end up with a legal definition of gender apartheid that can be very useful in describing the Afghan situation, and that is inhumane acts committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one gender group over any other gender group, and committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. So there's discrimination against women to varying degrees everywhere in the world. This is a very particular, very specific, very extreme kind of problem. And I have to say that this approach has been strongly supported by a number of Black South African feminist scholars, and in particular, the work of a woman named Penelope Andrews, who's the first Black woman in South Africa to become the dean of a law school, was very influential in my thinking. She suggested some 10 years ago in a very important book called From Cape Town to Kabul that it would be possible to basically add gender to the definition of apartheid in the Apartheid Convention, another relevant standard, and that that would lead to an accurate description of a situation like Taliban Afghanistan, and the sort of solidarity of many prominent South Africans in using this approach, learning from their experience to try to more effectively confront this 21st century version of apartheid has been very important and very inspiring. So the idea has really taken off since I published my article, and I don't, claim responsibility for this. I think my article was one piece of a kind of dynamic synergy, and in particular, I think the most critical element here was the courage and leadership of Afghan women human rights defenders on the ground, who just wouldn't give up and have actually continued to protest inside the country, even though it's incredibly dangerous to do that. And I should say, actually, there are many other country situations in which women human rights defenders have used the concept of gender apartheid to try to describe at least part of the system or the political forces that they're battling, including in Iran, in Yemen, in Saudi Arabia, and also, interestingly, in Israel. So some Jewish feminists in Israel dealing with human rights problems associated with the rise of the ultra-Orthodox movements and so on. And so there are a number of contexts in which this has been discussed, but I think Taliban Afghanistan is really the archetypal example of gender apartheid because of the scale of the exclusions. And so my work has focused primarily on this example. So let me turn next to this issue, and this may be an obvious one, depending on how much attention that you've paid to some of the news coming out of Afghanistan. How does the current situation in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan constitute gender apartheid? Well, we see that the Taliban have now excluded women from virtually all aspects of public life, just as they did in the 1990s. And I have to say that having worked with Afghan women human rights defenders for many years, I was very aware that Taliban 2.0, as it was called, the idea that there was some sort of new Taliban, was a complete fabrication. And Afghan women warned the world of precisely what was going to happen. And that is what has unfolded. It shouldn't have been a surprise. We've seen that in over 65 decrees since they returned to power. The Taliban have excluded women from all of these spheres of life. So with education, women and girls are excluded from university and secondary school. And in fact, the Taliban are the only governing group in the world to have systematically excluded most women and girls from education, both in the late 20th century and now again in the early 21st century. Employment. Women have been banned from working for national and international non-governmental organizations. In violation of the UN Charter, they have been banned from working for the UN. They have been dismissed from jobs with the government and in a variety of sectors. And you have to imagine this is in a country full of war widows and in the middle of one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. So the impact of these exclusions are really compounded. That brings us to health. The Taliban have banned birth control, and they are enforcing that ban by threatening pharmacies and midwives. And this is in a context of spiraling maternal mortality rates. There are also apartheid restrictions that apply in healthcare. So the Taliban's deputy health minister has said that only women doctors can treat women. And think of the way that these different exclusions then compound one another and are interlocking, because given that women and girls are being denied their right to an education, will there be female healthcare workers available? Women have also been denied medical care in certain instances if they seek it without the presence of a male chaperone. Freedom of movement. The Taliban have banned driver's licenses for women. They have banned travel longer than 45 miles without a male legal guardian. They have banned solo taxi rides for women. And one Taliban leader actually issued a statement encouraging women simply to stay home most of the time unless there was some exceptional reason to leave. I mean, just imagine this. It's sort of the idea of being on lockdown permanently. In the sphere of public life and recreation, women have been banned from parks, gyms, public baths. They can't participate in sports. They can't go to national parks. Women's beauty salons, which was the last public gathering place for them, have now been shuttered. And all of this has been accompanied by basically dismantling of the legal regime that women human rights defenders had fought so hard to create in the years when the Taliban wasn't in power. So between 2002 and up to 2021 when they came back to power. They have talked about abrogating the 2004 Constitution and the 2009 Elimination of Violence Against Women law. And their policies basically represent a total de facto rejection of those standards. And we all know they got rid of the mechanisms for women's protection, such as transforming the Ministry of Women's Affairs into the Ministry of Vice and Virtue, which actually persecutes women. Then we have a situation where women engaging in protests against these gender apartheid policies face tremendous repression. This is very similar to anti-apartheid opponents in South Africa as well. Sometimes these women and even members of their families face arrest, torture, ill treatment, and incommunicado detention. And at the moment, I have to say I'm deeply concerned by the recent sentencing of the woman you see on the screen, a woman protester, Manija Siddiqui. She's been sentenced to 2 years in prison after being abducted from her home in October last year and then being essentially disappeared for months, her fate and her whereabouts unknown until it emerged recently that in fact she's now been sentenced to this 2-year term in prison in the custody of the Taliban, which is a really terrifying thing to contemplate. So I think if we take all this together, it becomes clear why the German foreign minister referred to this as overall the biggest violation on earth of women's rights. And the point is that we need an international response that is commensurate with this reality on the ground. Now, a complicating factor here, of course, is that meanwhile, one of the world's worst humanitarian crises is unfolding, with millions facing hunger and resulting abuses, including reports of the sale of children, girls in particular. And I think the international community has sort of wanted to tilt towards focusing on the humanitarian crisis instead of talking as much about the human rights catastrophe. And for me, this is a mistake. We actually have to understand these things as interlocking. When women suffer, such as by being denied employment during an economic crisis, their families suffer too. So there's a sort of spillover effect of gender apartheid more broadly on the population, just like with racial apartheid. And I think of what Alison Davidian, who's the representative for UN Women in Afghanistan, said this year on International Women's Day. Just a few weeks ago, she said the space for Afghan women and girls continues to shrink at an alarming pace, and with it, Afghanistan's future prospects to escape a vicious cycle of war, poverty, and isolation. So again, confronting these two problems, gender apartheid and the humanitarian crisis together in a principled way, not trading one off against the other is, I think, absolutely critical. So given all of this, I think it's no accident that almost all of the Afghan women advocates that I interviewed for my article agreed with the characterization of the country's situation as gender apartheid when I interviewed them. And they did this mainly because they found it to accurately reflect the way in which Taliban policy removes women from government and society. That's a quote, as one of the women told me. And look at this amazing work of art by an anonymous Afghan girl artist on screen, I think really capturing that feeling of just being entirely trapped by the restrictions. I think the Afghan women I interviewed also agreed with this approach because they knew that the apartheid framework had been a key tool that was used in improving the lived reality of Black South Africans in the past. And I have to say, the UN response and international norms were only one component of anti apartheid initiatives, but they contributed to the ultimate success of these efforts with the end of de jure racial apartheid beginning in 1990. My argument really here is that international law should learn from its successes, especially in light of the many failures that international law has experienced, including in Afghanistan. And that brings me really to the next question, and I'm going to skip through some slides to save time, so we make sure to get to the Q&A. If the situation in Afghanistan rises to the level of something called gender apartheid, what is the added value? How can using this construct actually support Afghan women on the front lines? What is the added value? So you see, I think, some of the reasons for this on the screen. One is that apartheid is an international crime. You can actually be prosecuted for the crime of apartheid, currently drafted to focus on racial apartheid. But if we change that and add gender, it will be possible to have prosecutions in the International Criminal Court for gender apartheid. But the criminal aspect is just one piece. I really view this as a new overall human rights framework for tackling the situation. Ultimately, the point is to help end the apartheid restrictions. And one of the Afghan women I interviewed said that the apartheid framing can be what she called a powerful mobilizing tool. And I think that was certainly the case with apartheid South Africa. So really trying to mobilize internationally so that there is a sort of synergy of international advocacy in support of the grassroots work that's being done on the ground. That's the model from apartheid South Africa, which I recognize different times, different contexts, but many things we can learn from that. And then we come to what I think is the most important piece of the added value here, which is that apartheid law puts pressure on second governments, international organizations, and even transnational corporations not to engage with the Taliban in ways that show tolerance for and help to perpetuate grave abuses. And I think this is the most important aspect of the apartheid framework because the Taliban are deeply ideologically committed to their abuses, just like the apartheid regime in South Africa was. And so the ordinary human rights model, where you sort of engage with the state in Geneva conference rooms, and this leads to positive steps forward, that simply isn't going to work here. I think the only chance of real change is if there is consistent, principled, concerted international response that insists on respect for international law and basic principles of the UN Charter in support of the Afghan women human rights defenders who are leading the push for this on the front lines and in the diasporas. I think the apartheid framework also can help strengthen the pariah status of the perpetrators. And Penelope Andrews talks about this a lot, how important that was in putting pressure on white South Africans to sort of force their government ultimately to make change because of the amount of stigma that that government received and sort of the consequences overall for South Africa of that view, that pariah status. And at the same time, the apartheid framing can elevate the international status of the opponents of gender apartheid. And I always think about this, it's not an exact analogy, but apartheid South Africa was thrown out of the UN General Assembly. That was basically unprecedented. And the African National Congress had observer status in the UN. And I, have this sort of idea that wouldn't it be wonderful to imagine something like an Afghan women's mission at the UN to really highlight the international importance of their work. And I think this is another piece that we can get here from using the apartheid framework. And there's so much more that I could say. But I am going to jump forward again just to get to the discussion. So what might be some of the possible policy consequences for Afghanistan of using this framework? So one is that it can help maintain the sanctions. I think it is critical to maintain the sanctions on the Taliban leadership who are already sanctioned as so long as these, at least so long as these gender apartheid restrictions remain in place. And here I'm not talking about sanctioning the country of Afghanistan or the people. And the women I interviewed always stressed how important it is to make sure that measures taken are not harming the population. Here I'm talking about sanctions on the Taliban themselves, travel bans, and so on. There has been some wobbling in particular about exemptions to travel bans. I'm very grateful to the government of Ireland that stood strong to maintain those travel bans in light of the restrictions in the Security Council. I think the apartheid framing can help with that. I think we need to make sure that the Taliban do not get the seat of Afghanistan in the UN. That would be a catastrophe, not only for Afghan women, but for women everywhere. I think people are reeling right now. Saudi Arabia has just been elected president of the UN Commission on the Status of Women. A lot of shock over that. And I just can't even imagine what the international reaction would be were the Taliban ever to actually be given the seat of Afghanistan in the UN. They did not get it last time. They don't have it now. And I think the South African precedent can really contribute to preventing them from being recognized officially and being able to take that seat at the UN, which would give them many, many benefits. And finally, I think the apartheid framework gives us a tool for basically scrutinizing complicity with apartheid when governments and even international organizations seek to normalize the Taliban despite all of these restrictions that I've been talking about. And as the UN Special Rapporteur and the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women said in their joint report last year, apartheid framing highlights that other states and actors and the international community at large have a duty to take effective action to end the practice, as was done to end racial apartheid in Southern Africa. And I would say, again, this matters most for Afghan women. but it matters to women across the region, and the Taliban rule is really a terrible precedent, and it is crucial for women everywhere and to the credibility of international law and the UN system going forward. So I think it's really important to contemplate some of the possible positive policy consequences, the added value. I am not saying this is a magic bullet. At the end of the day, political will is what is needed most of all, but this can be a set of tools for mobilizing that political will and basically shaming states that don't show it. And let me just talk about some of the recent advances, what has been happening in terms of actually starting to use the gender apartheid framing, that here we see another amazing artistic description of a depiction of from an Afghan girl artist. So the international reaction to the calls by Afghan women to recognize the situation as gender apartheid, those reactions have just been amazing in the last couple of years. I've been so positively surprised. Here you see Nelson Mandela's widow, Graça Machel, an anti-apartheid icon in her own right, who says of Taliban rule, it is a kind of apartheid. I agree with that definition of gender apartheid. And she calls for the same kind of response to gender apartheid in Afghanistan as to racial apartheid in South Africa, an incredibly powerful voice. We see a range of UN officials using the gender apartheid approach. Even the UN Secretary General himself has used the concept. The High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Director General of UN Women, making a very strong statement in this regard. Malala Yousafzai, the Nobel laureate, has taken up this cause. And actually, in December, she gave her Nelson Mandela address on the 10th anniversary of his death in Johannesburg, entirely about the topic of gender apartheid in Afghanistan, calling on the international community to recognize this and to stand with Afghan women human rights defenders. And in a development that I have to say really surprised me, there's been so much movement forward that I was invited to speak to the Security Council back in September about gender apartheid in Afghanistan. And there you see me listening to the head of UNAMA, the UN Assistance Mission for Afghanistan. But there was another intervention in that meeting that I found so positive, and that was Sima Bahous, the executive director of UN Women, who called on the international community to lend its full support to an intergovernmental process to explicitly codify gender apartheid in international law, basically saying the tools the international community currently has at its disposal were not created to respond to this kind of mass state-sponsored gender oppression. Unfortunately, there's that positive trend. Meanwhile, on the ground, things are getting worse. And there's also another countervailing trend, which is a move towards greater normalization of the Taliban, greater engagement with the Taliban without clear limits on when that engagement is appropriate, what kind of engagement it is having on women's human rights on the ground. And I think one of the reasons we most need gender apartheid now is as a tool against that normalization. So where do we go from here? What are some of the strategies that we can use to take this forward? There are three tracks that you see on the screen that I talk about, and I'm going to really focus on the first two here. The first is we need to apply the existing apartheid law created in the 20th century. Even though it was drafted explicitly to respond to racial apartheid, we need to use this now with a forward-looking, gender-inclusive interpretation that includes gender apartheid. And I'll just give you one example of how this can be done. So when I was still the UN Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights in September of 2021, I issued a statement regarding the ban on Afghan women and girls participating in sports, saying that the spirit of the Convention on Apartheid in Sports applies to the Taliban's ban, even if the letter of that convention didn't yet apply because of the definition of apartheid, which is focused on race. We have the support of the South African government. Namibia also spoke up in the Human Rights Council in support of this framing, so two of the states most affected by racial apartheid. And this is the way international law has moved forward over many years, in particular in the field of women's human rights, which is with forward looking, victim centered definitions and interpretations that ultimately are explicitly codified. You have to be very methodologically careful and rigorous in doing that. But this is the way international law improves and becomes more inclusive and responsive to women's human rights. The second sort of mode of work here is that meanwhile, we also need to be pushing for the explicit codification of gender apartheid in international law. And there are a range of possible ways of doing that. But there's an urgent possibility that is available now through a Crimes Against Humanity Convention that is being drafted, we hope, in the Sixth Committee of the UN General Assembly. And there's actually a meeting starting on the 1st of April, so next week, to discuss that draft. And led by Afghan women, there's a huge international campaign to get gender apartheid added to the definition of apartheid in the Crimes Against Humanity Convention, and I can say much more about that in Q&A if people are interested. And the good news is that 6 states have already raised this issue, with, I think, the best set of comments really coming from Malta, which has explained that how essential it is to add gender apartheid here as a way of enabling victims and survivors to hold perpetrators to account for the totality of crimes committed by systematized oppression, and that gender apartheid is really the tool for doing that. And I hope that many more states will do so in the lead up to next week's meeting, during that meeting, and going forward. And anyone who has governmental contacts, I encourage you to use them to ask for that. And let me just end with one thing really quickly, and that is the connection back to security. So this is a human rights issue, but it's also a security issue. And I was really struck here by the writing of Nazifa Hakpal, who's an Afghan woman, former diplomat, who made the direct linkage between gender apartheid in Afghanistan and the international security challenges posed by the Taliban rule. And she said that any failure to see these links, basically between the dangers the Taliban and its terrorist associates pose to stability and the grave violations of the rights of women and girls in Afghanistan, anyone who fails to see that link is really ignoring what she calls an unprecedented security challenge. And she reminds us that it is both a moral obligation and a security imperative to tackle this problem. And I think that's where I'm going to end. So thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Karima. That was really an excellent presentation and provided so much detail, so crisply presented. I guess where I'd like to start. So first of all, everybody in attendance, please feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A box in Zoom. But I think one place, there's so many issues to cover about what you're discussing, but one of the most striking seems to me were some set of bodies at the United Nations or a collection of states or through a special rapporteur, through some process to clarify the gender apartheid concept and clarify how that's applied to Afghanistan. And this was used as a way to exert pressure on the Taliban government. Would you then agree, would you see it as productive to lay out a series of particular actions the government could take that would ameliorate the conditions such that those sanctions and the tag of gender apartheid would be somehow withdrawn? If you get my point, it seems like gender apartheid presumes a sort of structural, institutionalized repression that's enormously difficult to disentangle. And if it was used as a tool of political pressure, is there really a way an existing Taliban government could retain power and engage in actions that would show their seriousness of combating it?
So I think that this issue has been explored to some degree in the recent assessment report of Afghanistan that was commissioned by the UN Security Council. which I think sort of was trying to think along these lines. But there has also been a strong critique of that report from a number of Afghan women human rights defenders. And I encourage anyone who's interested to look for the shadow assessment that was done by a woman's NGO called DROPS. The acronym is DROPS, originally based in Kabul, that really sort of challenges some of the way that this was set out, because the assessment report tries to sort of divide Afghan women's rights and refer to some rights as fundamental and the others as perhaps not specifically designated this way, but because they're not seen as fundamental, being sort of less essential. I think the fear of that Afghan women have is that the approach would be that, well, if you just open a few schools, you know, as some sort of window dressing, or even if you just tackle the right to education, but not any of the other restrictions, that you could move forward, that would really be insufficient. And to really look at the sort of interlinkages, the whole system of sort of rights deprivation. But I do think, you know, I mean, I think that's what we want to see governments doing, setting out a very clear set of benchmarks drawn from the international obligations of the government of Afghanistan, which has ratified, amongst other things, the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and without reservations. And any body that wants to claim to be the government of Afghanistan is going to inherit those obligations. And what we want to see is that governments have resolve in really insisting on that, and not giving up and not making the conditions sort of too easy. I fear somehow that the international community now can't really imagine any other situation in Afghanistan than the current situation. And what's inspiring about Afghan women is that they haven't given up on the idea of a better future, and they haven't given up on the idea that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights applies to them just like everybody else.
You raise such an interesting point, which is the Taliban government wants to be internationally recognized as the governing body of this state called Afghanistan. And yet, and as you rightly point out, the state is bound by all sorts of conventions that a different government representing that same state approved. So, has the Taliban government made formal declarations, statements, or in any way assessed its obligations under international law that it's bound by?
The only step that I'm aware of was the UN CEDAW committee, so the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women that monitors the Women's Convention, asked for an exceptional report when the Taliban returned to power and imposed gender apartheid. And this is something that the committee can do in an emergency situation. They've done it in the past in some other country situations. And the Taliban responded to that, but they did that with a very paltry statement. I think it's about 5 or 6 pages long, basically claiming that things had gotten better for women in Afghanistan after they came to power, and just simply lying. We know, for example, that suicide rates among women have spiraled due to the gender apartheid restrictions, and the Taliban were, in fact, claiming precisely the opposite of what the data shows. And as far as I know, that's the only clear engagement with international human rights standards that they've had. We've seen precisely the opposite. A Taliban leader for the new year recently mentioned, basically confirmed, that they are going to continue using corporal punishment against women, including stoning. So in fact, the Taliban leadership moving in the other direction. But there certainly is a faction of the Taliban that wants international recognition. They want to be at the table. They want legitimacy. And I think that has to be used to pressure them. That can't just be given. And I think it's really a big mistake to think that you can look the other way on women's human rights while just focusing on, you know, security issues. I think that's why that point that Nazifa Hakpal made is so important. You know, these things again go together, they're interlinked.
A question here from Martin Fahey. What role does culture play in the denial of women's rights? Given the difficulties experienced with the Rome Statute in the early days, how likely do you think it is that the definitional change will be adopted? If adopted, how likely do you think it is that the ICC would engage in charges? I guess
Yes.
to Taliban.
So these are great questions. I could give a very long-winded answer to each of them, and I'll try to be relatively brief. So the first question, culture is sort of deployed around the world to justify violations of women's human rights. In fact, I think there's no group of human beings that has suffered more from these kinds of purported cultural justifications of rights violations than women. And I was the UN Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights for 6 years, as Daniel mentioned in my introduction. And in fact, you know, one I felt like one of my most important jobs was to remind people constantly that while culture and participation in cultural life is very important to human existence, it's cultural rights are not a justification for violations of human rights or for discrimination. They are not the same thing as cultural relativism, which is basically sort of different standards applied to different people on the basis of the claimed categories that they fit into. As a matter of law, governments around the world from all regions, from all different kinds of cultural systems, have recognized the universality of human rights, from the Universal Declaration to the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action adopted in the 1990s, where more governments were at the table. And all of the recent UN human rights standards that have been adopted, including, for example, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, have yet again, with governments from all regions and all kinds of systems and all kinds of cultural backgrounds at the table, have again affirmed this principle that everyone is entitled to all of the human rights in the Universal Declaration, regardless of who they are and sort of what groups they belong to. And I think one thing that's really interesting is that we tend to be so much more comfortable accepting cultural justifications for violations of women's rights than in any other category, even though the law says that's unacceptable. Just in sort of ordinary parlance, even in academia, you run into a fair amount of this. And I think one of the reasons the apartheid framing is important also is that apartheid South Africa, the authorities tried there too to have a religious justification for apartheid based on their interpretation of religion, of in that case Christianity. And the International Court of Justice in the Namibia case found that completely irrelevant. There's no possible justification for this kind of systematic discrimination that is a violation of the UN Charter itself, which guarantees non-discrimination. So there's a long, I won't belabor it, but there's a long passage in my paper that deals with this issue, and actually Afghan women contesting the Taliban's right to speak for Afghan culture. You know, sometimes what the Taliban are claiming to impose is actually radically different than the lived traditions of Afghans. I mean, very often that's the case. I can give a couple of examples. So Afghan women's traditional clothes don't look like a burqa. There was a wonderful campaign, hashtag do not touch my clothes, where Afghan women actually posted on social media pictures of themselves in their very colorful, embroidered and diverse dresses from all the regions of Afghanistan. Not at all the stereotypical vision of a woman in a blue burqa that the Taliban would like to think, like us to think is the sort of only vision of Afghan women. Or another example, the Taliban have banned music, destroying musical instruments in many instances. And sometimes in academia, we're told, oh, this is Pashtun culture. Actually, there are very great traditions of Pashtun music. And I was told this very strongly by some of the Afghan Pashtun women that I interviewed, amongst the many other women that I interviewed for my article. So I think we have to push back very hard on the cultural piece. So on the ICC, so just to distinguish, there's a couple of possible paths here. So one route is to change the definition of apartheid from the Rome Statute as it is being used in this new Convention on Crimes Against Humanity. And so that change would then affect that convention and perhaps national use of the concept of apartheid around the world. There's another suggestion, and that's the one that's very urgent, that's going to be happening, we hope, starting really this year, starting next week. And I hope people will push hard for that. There's also been a suggestion made that what we could do is to push for an amendment to the Rome Statute itself so that the International Criminal Court could prosecute gender apartheid. That's a trickier thing because it would be a sort of initiative, a standalone initiative. The Crimes Against Humanity Convention is a project that's been discussed for a long time. They're coming out of the International Law Commission. And so that's part of a broader initiative. I don't mean to say it's going to be easy to make progress there, but amending the Rome Statute itself I think would be a bit trickier, but I think if the crimes against humanity path doesn't work, we have to perhaps contemplate that. And it would be very important to see prosecutions of Taliban leaders for gender apartheid. Meanwhile, there's also something called gender persecution in the Rome Statute. And persecution is a concept that's been around in international criminal law for a long time. And this was an innovation in the 1990s, pushed for very strongly by feminists. And persecution focuses on particular kinds of atrocities carried out with a discriminatory animus. And I think we hope there may be indictments for Taliban leaders for gender persecution, but I think gender apartheid is an essential complement to gender persecution, and in international law, both racial persecution and racial apartheid are prohibited. These are concepts which highlight different aspects of the Taliban regime and need to be used in complementary fashion. So that I promised a short answer. That was a very long answer. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much. A question here from an anonymous attendee. What more do you think that the UN Human Rights Council can do?
That's a great question. So the Human Rights Council actually has asked the UN Special Rapporteur on Afghanistan, Richard Bennett of New Zealand, for a report that is to be delivered in June that looks at basically systematic discrimination, humiliation, exclusion of women, basically describing gender apartheid without using the term because some states are reticent to do so. And I hope that that report will call for the recognition and codification of gender apartheid. I don't know yet what the content will be. That is coming out in June. And if there's that kind of language in there, I very much hope that the Human Rights Council will then adopt the recommendations of the Special Rapporteur. Meanwhile, starting to pass resolutions using the terminology of gender apartheid. I think the door is open to do that, given that the Special Rapporteur himself has used this terminology, as has the High Commissioner for Human Rights. But of course, the Human Rights Council is a political body made up of states, and so that will be a political debate rather than an objective technical debate about human rights. And we see some countries, China, Russia, some of the Central Asian neighboring countries, really pushing in the direction of normalization. Frankly, I think the U.S. government is ambivalent, actually. I think they have a stated commitment to the rights of Afghan women, but I think there's part of the government that very much wants to work with the Taliban on certain issues. And we'll see. I was thrilled. I mean, the US government actually is one of the governments that at least mentioned this possibility that's being discussed of adding gender apartheid to the Crimes Against Humanity Convention in the comments that they made in December. And I was very grateful for that. So I think maybe some of those working on various atrocity related issues support this position. I think there may be others working along other tracks that may want to set some of this aside and not take as robust of an approach. So we need political leadership basically to galvanize the Human Rights Council to do the right thing. There's also the possibility that the council could create some kind of an investigative mechanism on Afghanistan. So for example, on Iran, there is both a special rapporteur and there's been a commission of inquiry that has just issued its first report. And I think a commission of inquiry can do much more in terms of preservation of evidence than the special rapporteur can do alone. But the rapporteur position is incredibly important and he deserves all the resources that he needs. But I think a complementary mechanism of that nature, like a commission of inquiry that could really preserve evidence for future prosecutions, would be absolutely essential. And I think the point is, to live up to the rhetoric. I think empty rhetoric about women's equality without the action necessary to guarantee it really undermines the Human Rights Project and undermines the UN. And so the Human Rights Council really needs to show principled leadership on these issues.
Thank you so much. A question from Mariah Mori. How might this designation, that is to say gender apartheid, affect Afghans who have fled the country and now reside in other countries? Will it help provide more clear pathways to citizenship or perhaps pave a way for a legal recourse against the Taliban?
That is such a great question, and I think I need to do a lot more thinking about it. But I think it can. I think it can really have a range of possible benefits for Afghans. I mean, we've seen some for Afghan women in particular. We've seen some countries, Denmark, for example, very wisely offering asylum basically to any Afghan woman. I mean, being an Afghan woman just sort of puts you in that category. I'd like to see more governments do that. And I think if we get it designated as an apartheid regime, it becomes much easier to make that case. I know that there's a wonderful and very dynamic End Gender Apartheid campaign, and in tandem with the push for international codification, they're also calling for national jurisdictions to enact laws related to gender apartheid. And it would be really interesting to think about what kind of remedies could be built into that. And you know, you could think about a range of possibilities. Honestly, I really need to think much more about that. I would say also the codification of gender apartheid explicitly in international law can facilitate universal jurisdiction prosecutions of Taliban leaders for gender apartheid. And that is something that I would like to see happen all around the world. So, universal jurisdiction is basically a situation in which, you know, any government can prosecute certain kinds of international crimes in its own national courts. And we've seen some important cases lately, in particular related to the situation in Syria. This is especially important when absolutely no legal remedies are available at the domestic level. And I think what we have to do is be very holistic, make sure that Afghan women have a full legal toolkit, and we employ all of these tools in a holistic and complementary manner to achieve an effective response. Because my fear is that governments sort of think they can live with this situation. They can make certain kinds of statements denouncing it every year on March 8th, but that somehow it's just a problem for Afghans. It's just a reflection of their character and so on, and their culture, excuse me, and so on. And I think we really need to reject that view, and we need to embrace the vision of Nelson Mandela when he said the day that he left prison that as a form of governance, quote, apartheid has no future. And I think that's the vision of the 21st century that we have to fulfill.
Thank you so much. It's really an honor to host you here. Thank you, everybody who's joined us this evening. That's a powerful presentation, and we're really pleased to have you with us today.
Thank you so much.